As 1914 rolled around, Britain warns Canada of a deteriorating situation in Europe. It wasn't long after that, on August 5th, 1914, that Britain declared war. Canada, due to its ties with Britain, is automatically a part of the war. Canada at first only had 32,000 men to send to help Britain. The men were not prepared, for Canada was just starting to become a nation. The first major battle fought by Canadian troops in the First World War was the Second Ypres battle, which happened between April 22nd and May 25th, 1915. Canada lost 2,000 men out of the 6,035 men sent. In the end, the Canadians helped re-establish control of the battlefield. Then came along the Battle of Somme, which started on July 1st and ended the same year on November 18th, 1916. Within the war, Canada helped claim some strategic objectives, but with a heavy cost. They lost around 24,700 men. Almost a half year later, on April 9th, the Battle of Vimy Ridge started. Canada's goal was to seize the ridge, which they did on April 12th. During this conflict, there was around 10,500 casualties. Later that year, in mid-October of 1917, Canada joined the Battle of Passchendaele. The Canadian men, with their third large-scale attack, secured the ruins of the village and the victory of the war on November 10th, 1917. In the battle, 4,018 men were killed out of the original 15,654 men. The following year, on August 8, 1918, Canada went on the 100 Days Campaign, which was an aggressive series of offensive attacks that routed the Germans from their strongholds. This was a victory for Canada when the Germans fully retreated. By November 11, 1918, they completed their march to Mons. With the end of the march on November 11, 1918, came the end of World War I. The following summer, they signed the Treaty of Versailles, a document of peace terms imposed on Germany by the Allied victors. At home during the war, the cities and towns bustled with activity as factories converted to around-the-clock production of military equipment. Due to the shortage of farm help, the farmers began to mechanize their operations. During the Great War, Canadian women in 1916 were given the right to vote provincially in 4 western provinces. Then in 1917 in Ontario, in 1918 in Nova Scotia, 1919 in New Brunswick, in 1922 Prince Edward Island, and in 1940 in Quebec. But it was in 1919 that all women over 21 had the right to vote in federal election. Then came the 1920s, also known as the Roaring Twenties. The 20s seemed to usher in a new modern age, which also came with new inventions. Not everyone was roaring. The prairies farmers suffered from the collapse of the wheat market. Also within the 20s, Canada started growing more independent from Britain. In 1923, the Canadians' prime ministers demanded more independence. By the end of the decade, the country was more complex and diverse to govern. In late October of 1929, the stock market crashed in North America. Companies went bankrupt, stocks became worthless, civilians were forced into insolvency, many suicided while others lived in despair. This was then followed by the Great Depression, which was the suffering of unprecedented levels of poverty due to unemployment. This was also known as the Dirty Thirties. The recovery from the Great Depression happened very slowly. Then in the midst of the Depression, the Crown and Council attempted to uplift the people by creating the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Channel, CRBC, and the Bank of Canada. Both did what they were intended to do. The radio channel lifted the morale of Canadians up, and the bank played an important role to help steer the government spending in the right direction. Then came 1939, the start of the Second World War. But it wasn't until 2 years later that Canada actually fought independently instead of just sending troops to help Britain. A few years later, in December of 1941, Canadians went off to Hong Kong to defend the colony that was there. They failed to do so and surrendered. 554 out of the 1,050 men sent died, and the rest prisoners in Hong Kong until the end of the war. Around 8 months later, on August 19, 1942, Canada and Allied countries launched a major raid on a small French coast port, Dieppe. The raid was another failure. 3,367 out of the 5,000 men were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. The Italian campaign started with the invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and ended for Canada in February 1945. The goal wasn't to conquer Italy, but was to force Germany to divide their forces up, to make them vulnerable. In the end, the campaign was a success, but was costly. Out of the 76,000 Canadians that served in Italy, there was 25,264 casualties, and 5,900 of them were fatal. The year after the start of the Italian campaign, on June 6, 1944, Canada and the Allied forces invaded Normandy. It was the largest ambitious invasion to ever take place. It was a victory for the Allies. Out of the 18,444 men sent from Canada, 5,381 of them were killed. Within the final months of the Second World War, Canada was given the task to liberate the Netherlands from the Nazi occupation. It started in September 1944 and ended in April 1945. More than 7,600 Canadian soldiers, sailors, airmen died fighting in the Netherlands. Within the Second World War, Canada's Royal Canadian Air Force and Royal Canadian Navy played a huge part, especially with the advancements of technology from the First World War.